Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's program. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services here at the Center for Jewish History. I would like to thank the American Jewish Historical Society and the Leo Baeck Institute for co-sponsoring today's event with us. Just one announcement before we begin. We are running our summer reading schmooze, which is where you submit your Jewish-themed summer reading recommendations, and we share some of them on our social media, our e-newsletters, and once a month at our author events like this one, we announce the winner of some CJH swag. So this month's winner is Karen Tucker. She recommended a book called The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross, which was the subject of a book discussion we did a few months ago, for which we were joined by the author. It was a great event and a really good book, so I concur with the recommendation, and I'm just going to read her very short recommendation. A wonderfully inventive tragicomic novel about a shtetl that time forgot. The novel relates what happens to the isolated town when it's suddenly dragged into the modern era after being spared the ravages of the world wars and the Holocaust. So again, that's The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross. And thank you, Karen. And for any of you interested in participating, we'll put the link in the chat for our summer reading schmooze. And that reminds me, the chat is disabled for participants, so please, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. You can type them in as we go along. So the plan for today is that we will look at some photos with the speakers, then I'll have a brief conversation with them, and then we will go to the audience Q&A, and it should all be wrapped up within about an hour. This program is being recorded, and it will be available on the center's webpage and YouTube page within a couple of weeks. And you will get an email about that when it's available if you registered for this program. All right, let me introduce today's speaker. Gabrielle Glaser is the author most recently of American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, which investigates post-war adoption in America through the bittersweet story of one teenager, the son she was forced to relinquish, and their lifelong search to find each other. Earlier this year, this book was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review and CBS Sunday Morning. Gabrielle's 2013 book, Examining Women's Drinking and the American Rehab Industry, Her Best Kept Secret, Why Women Drink and How They Can Regain Control, was a New York Times bestseller. She has covered the intersection of health, medicine, and culture for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and many other publications, including the Daily Beast, The Washington Post, and Scientific American. Margaret Erle Katz is an American and German citizen. Her courageous life story and desperate search for her son, Stephen, who she was forced to relinquish during the post-war adoption era, was documented in the book American Baby by Gabrielle Glaser. Margaret Katz is now an advocate and spokesperson for adoptee rights. She has created Margaret's Mitzvah Mission to help raise awareness about adoption laws. Her husband, George, the love of her life, passed away in 2000. After a lifelong search, Margaret was reunited with Stephen in 2014, just 3 months before he died. She is a mother of 4, grandmother to 6, and has now been called by many the American Philomena. So thank you both for being here. I think we're going to jump in with some slides. If you could get the photos up, Ty. Do you want to start us off, Margaret? As we can see here, you were high school sweethearts, and you were both from German-speaking Jewish families in Upper Manhattan, yet your families were opposed to your relationship. So why was that?
Well, I think it was because, which you have in many families, I believe, who immigrated to the US or other places, they wanted a better life, especially having dealt with the Holocaust. And when I got pregnant, it was like their dreams. I was crushing them. Yeah. Because when immigrants come here, they want a better life for themselves, but the most important thing is a better life for the next generations, right. Their children, their grandchildren. And at that time, the way the world was set up, this was like the worst thing that could happen to you, to any, young girl.
Right.
Also, they came from different backgrounds because they were both families were Jewish, both families spoke German, but one was from Vienna, Austria, and the other was from two different towns, from Fulda and Beisening in Germany. And, they both had different lives before they came here. And then also when they came here, they had to adopt, to do whatever they could to survive.
Okay, thanks. Can we look at the next photo, Ty? Okay, so this was the day you were sent away to the Lakeview home, and you didn't really have a lot of choice about that, correct?
I had basically no choice at all. I was a minor. I had no say in anything. George had no say in anything. My mother, I guess, and the doctor arranged everything. And in those days, if you didn't, the only option they had was stick you in jail. You were considered even getting pregnant a wayward minor.
And at that time, you were planning to get married and raise the child, and still thought that that was your option at that point, correct?
Yes. We both thought we'd finish school, we'd work, we'd go to college part-time, and we were a family, and we planned to, get married and be a family. Neither of us thought this kind of thing would happen.
And what was the experience like at the Lakeview home?
It wasn't that pleasant, but it wasn't as bad as like the Philomena movie. We all had chores, and we were told to change our names, not to speak to people. It wasn't a great place, but I survived, and tons of other girls there survived.
And can you tell us about the childbirth experience?
Well, that was sort of a horror show, because we really had very little prenatal care, if anything. And then when I went into labor, nobody seemed to care. My roommate went down to tell them, and they just said, just wait it out. What they did was, I still had to do my chores. And then they had a taxi, I guess, when they brought somebody else back, or whatever. And basically, I had my bag. It was snowy and icy, and I just had to go down to the taxi myself. And when I got to the hospital, it was almost like it was a sack of potatoes or something, the way I was treated. There was no kindness or anything. I said I wanted to be up when I had my baby. Basically, we had no rights whatsoever. You were one of those girls, is the way they put it.
Yeah. And I read, in the book that the doctor basically, and everyone just said, just forget this ever happened. You were expected to completely put it behind you. Can we look at the next photo? Okay, so both of your high school graduation photos. I think, Gabrielle, you wanted to say something about this.
Yes, I mean, if you look at these photographs of two, an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old, I guess Margaret was it was around your 18th birthday. They look so mature. They were already parents. They were secret parents. And when I saw this photograph for the first time, Margaret had told me about how George, as a really promising young athlete with a scholarship to become a pitcher at Ohio State, used that skill to go to arcades throughout the New York City area and use his pitcher's arm to win toasters and blenders and Corningware and cutlery that he would bring back on the subway or buses and hide them under his bed, take Polaroid photographs of them in order to try to convince social workers at the Louise Wise Agency, which we'll get to in a minute, and also in New York City itself, that he and Margaret, they may have been teenagers, but they were serious, and they had the kitchen stuff to be able to take care of their baby. Sort of heartbreaking.
All right, next photo. Okay, so this was one of the few times you were able to see him. How many times did you see him as a baby, Margaret?
I saw him twice at the agency in New York. Once when he was, I believe, 3 months, and this was when he was 5 months. I was not allowed. That's the first time when he was 3 months that I was able to hold him. They wouldn't let me in the hospital, and they wouldn't let me see him. George and I snuck out and looked through the nursery. He was like 6'2", so he was able to at least see a sign saying, I think it was Earl Boy. You know, I didn't even know if my son was there.
So what was your experience like with the social workers? I know at one point you had aspirations to be a social worker, but then you may have changed your mind during this ordeal.
I had wanted to be a social worker. Even after this, I had thought about it because I wanted to help people. I did not know that, you know, the social workers until sort of the very end, you know, when she threatened me with jail or juvenile hall. I had no idea that they, you know, really weren't caring. I really believed that they thought they were doing the best thing for, you know, my child and me, even though that's not what we wanted. And we fought to, you know, bring him home. But I was also young, you know, I didn't understand.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it was the Department of Welfare from New York, but the other part of it was Louise Wise. And I always believed if this was a Jewish organization, they were here to help, you know, Jewish people.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just, the whole thing just was so frightening and almost unreal.
We'll definitely get into the questions about the Louise Wise Services in a little bit. Can we get to the next slide, Ty? Okay, so this was your family wedding, but you actually eloped before that secretly without telling your parents. So can you tell us why you did that and a little bit about that experience?
Well, you know, even after we had the baby, once we had the Jewish wedding, everybody, you know, was okay. But before that, they really didn't want us to be together. And I was afraid they'd never sign. You had to be, the woman had to be 18, the man had to be 21 to get married in New York. So I went to the public library on 42nd Street. I researched and I found, you know, different places where we could get married if we were underage. Most people in those days, you heard through the grapevine, went to Maryland. But the problem with Maryland, you needed a blood test. And I thought George would pass out because when I had them, he just couldn't handle the blood. So we went to Dillon, South Carolina, and, you know, it was scary.
Yeah.
And in fact, they had a big cross there, and the justice of the peace who married us. And, you know, here I am, this young Jewish girl thinking Hashem is going to strike me dead. You know, and George just said, we'll go to the rabbi when we get home. Everything will be okay. But it was planned out. I left 24 hours before he did because I was terrified that, you know, somebody would stop us at the port or something and, you know, separate us or throw us in jail.
Next slide, Ty. Okay, so you were married at this point, and this is your first baby as a married couple. And I know throughout this time you were trying to get information about your son and never gave up looking, searching in secret. And it's clear from the book that you felt a lot of shame through most of these years, which is really heartbreaking to read about. So how did you try to track down your son?
Well, when, you know, we were first married and my two other kids in New York were little, I called a couple of times, but I was just hung up on. And basically, in the first couple of years, I would just, you know, look and see, oh, is somebody looking like George or, you know, my family or his family when I was on a train or when I was walking in the park. I mean, little did I know I could have been on a park bench, you know, with Lisa and the poodles. And David's mother was sitting. I could have spoken to her and not even realized it. But then once I got out to Jersey, and a number of years later, my youngest daughter was born, I joined Alma. I saw it in a paper, and that's when I really started to search as far as going to the public library in New York again on 42nd Street, the same place that I searched where we could get married, and, you know, trying to find his birth certificate.
All right, well, we'll get to how he actually found you in a little bit. Can we get to the next slide, Ty? Okay, so this was your son's bar mitzvah, correct?
Yes, yes.
And you had 3 additional children?
Yes.
Okay. And when did your husband get sick?
He was he played all kinds of sports. He was fine. He got sick. I think he was in his early 40s when he had gout. And David had gout, I think, when he was 20 or 23.
And you did try to share health information with the agency, right?
Yes. And then when he had something weird called sarcoidosis, he went to Deborah Hospital and they did a lung biopsy. And he was put on prednisone, and that supposedly triggered the diabetes, but it was type 2 diabetes. Nobody in the family had anything like that. He liked his Hostess cupcakes, his soda.
Margaret, how did the agency react when you tried to share health information with them so that they could share it with your firstborn son?
I thought that they, made notes of it, and that, they were telling his family. And basically, when I finally spoke to David, it never happened. Anything in the family, even though it was far-fetched or it came from lifestyle, I let them know. So at least, the kids can have themselves checked.
But you found out that they were never passing along the information.
Nothing.
Okay. Can we look at the next slide, which I think is the last one? Okay, so this is when you met the son that you had named Stephen. His name was David Rosenberg, and he was very ill at that time. How did he find you?
December of 2013, his wife bought him the 23andMe DNA kit. And then he finally got some connections back. I think it was in April. And he didn't even really do anything about it. There was a woman in Atlanta who's also a search angel. And she said she was my 4th cousin. And she reached out to him, I believe. And she said, would you like me to help you find your family? And at first he was hesitant. And then he said, what do I have to lose? His parents had died. His father, when he was 16, he died the same day that my husband died. Different year. His mother had passed, I think, when he was 30 or before that. And he was already 52. And he really said he wasn't looking for the family, because also he had been told that I didn't want him, that we didn't want him. And, when he got the write-ups and stuff and shared it with me, everything was lies, which, shocked me, and I believe shocked him.
So I imagine you're still in touch with his family?
Yes.
And if you're comfortable talking about it, how did your children react to all this?
Well, my youngest, just as soon as I told her about David and her got in touch with each other. She was in Berlin, Germany, and she shared like the baby pictures and stuff that we had here. Once she got over the shock, everyone was totally shocked. They just never, almost not believing it.
Because you kept everything so secret for so long.
Yes. And,
all right, well, maybe we can stop the screen share and bring Gabrielle into the conversation. Gabrielle, can you share some historical background to this period in American history about, the post-war baby boom and how this was also a baby boom in unwed parenthood?
So after the war, in the years after World War II, there was, as everyone knows, a huge baby boom. The greatest demographic wave in US history. Married couples were marrying at a frenzied pace. They had delayed marriage and childbearing during the Depression and certainly during World War II. That was the thing to do, get married and have kids. But in an era of no sex education, very little birth control, even for some married couples until Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, and certainly no legal abortion nationwide until 1973, there was also a sort of shadow baby boom of young women who were getting pregnant before they were married. There was plenty of space in new suburban homes and private bedrooms and rec rooms that kids had access to privacy for the first time. And about 4 million, at least 4 million young women who were not married got pregnant and were forced by their families, by religious mores, by their communities, and in many cases, like Margaret was mentioning, the law, which criminalized premarital sex among minors. So these women were forced into maternity homes like Margaret was, from just honestly from Alaska to Florida, and a predatory adoption system that had a lot of money at stake was able to place children with infertile couples who were also really eager to join the baby boom. And in an era before no assisted reproductive technology, or at least very little of it, adoption was the only route to creating a family.
And can you talk a little bit about what the process was like with the boarding homes and the extended periods before the baby was placed with the family?
So at least, especially in New York, there was a series, and I'll just say this at the outset. The agency at the center of this book, of course, this is Margaret's story, and to a lesser extent, David's story as well, because he's no longer with us. But the agency at the center of this book, it was Louise Wise Services, which was founded by the wife of Rabbi Stephen Wise, Louise Wise, and its mission, when it developed in 1916, was to be able to place Jewish orphans who were truly orphaned by disease in tenement housing and by their father's factory work in terrible conditions, whether it was typhoid or cholera, or I guess cholera was a thing of the past by 1916, but disease was rampant in the early 1900s, and there were plenty of Jewish children who had no homes. They were roaming the streets, and this agency developed to place truly orphaned children with Jewish homes.
And we should say that Louise Wise, the wife of Stephen Wise, a famous Reform rabbi, these are sort of heroic figures in American Jewish history. And, there are papers of theirs at the American Jewish Historical Society. So it's especially painful to not their personal involvement, to learn about the involvement of the agency named for them and then run by their daughter, another heroic figure, Justine Wise Paulier, who was the first female justice in New York State, who was, I believe, active in the agency at this time, correct?
Yes, she took the reins of the agency after her mother's death in 1947. And that coincided with the shift, the huge demand. That was the very beginning of the baby boom, the 2 years after the war, and the demand for infants was seriously growing. If you couldn't have a child and you were left out of this new social phenomenon of a new middle-class life and a happy home in the suburbs, you turned to an agency you trusted. And in New York, it was state law established around the time that I believe the agency was founded, that the religion of the birth mother dictated the home to which the child, with whom in which the child would be placed. So in New York State, if you were Catholic, and a birth mother who was Catholic, you dealt with Catholic charities. In New York City, at least, the only place to go was Louise Wise Services. And definitely the mission and the mandate of the agency shifted in the years after the war, where the demand was so high for babies. Before 1950, there were as many as 30 Jewish families waiting for one Jewish infant. That shifted, that ratio changed a little bit as the baby boom went on, but around the time that Margaret gave birth to Stephen, the ratio was 10 waiting families for each baby who was surrendered.
And you were going to tell us about the process or the boarding homes and the idea to scientifically match the babies.
So Louise Wise branded itself as the premier agency that could guarantee you a child that was as good, or if not better, than the one you couldn't conceive yourself. And in order to do this, they kept children in foster care for at least 6 months. Number one, to be able, there was a board member at Louise Wise Services, a forensic anthropologist whose skill during World War II was identifying the remains of unidentified soldiers and seamen. And he based his work on 19th century pseudoscience, phrenology, and he tested skulls and identified the remains in this way, in this very crude, not at all evidence-based way. And somebody at Louise Wise Services came up with the idea that Harry Shapiro that was his name, Harry Shapiro would be able to identify the future pigment of a child in order to best match him with waiting couples. So that was one reason. Harry Shapiro would identify somehow looking at nail beds and hair follicles and checking for different birthmarks to see how light-skinned a child would be. And it maybe if he or she was biracial, he would declare whether or not he or she would be able to pass. That was one thing. And most disturbingly, as if that's not chilling enough, most disturbingly, there was a pediatrician on the board of Louise Wise named Samuel Karelitz, who was a well-known, well-respected authority in New York City on children's crying, on infant crying. How did he become that expert? Well, he had this idea and a hypothesis that the babies who cried the most were the most intelligent. And this was a tool that the agency decided to use for its advantage. They offered, never written, but spoken promises about the future intelligence of a child. Here's how they did it. Karelitz developed a test in which he designed a gigantic rubber band gun. It was about this big, in which he and his associates would stretch a gigantic rubber band, the thick kind that you would have around a pile of mail, aim it toward the sole of a 10-minute-old infant's foot, and let go. And then Karelitz and his colleagues would record the decibels of the babies crying, and the babies who cried the most. This test was conducted for at least the first 3 months of a child's life. Those babies were deemed the most intelligent, and therefore then the proper baby to go to doctors, prominent lawyers, and businessmen. If a baby didn't cry as much, he or she was deemed of lesser intelligence, and those were the babies who went to postal workers or working class folks who were also on the waiting list.
So how do you square the role of these largely German Jewish scientists and researchers, Holocaust refugees who worked at the agency, carrying out this type of experimentation?
That was a question I asked so many people. I asked rabbinical authorities. I turned to Arthur Kaplan, the bioethicist at NYU. I presented the material to him, and he said, I'll be damned. And I said, do you have any guidance for me? What could possibly have been going through their heads at this time? And by the way, I want to point out that the rubber band studies were not mincing words. They were published over a period of 15 years, at least 10 of these studies, and they were named induced crying in neonates. So there was nobody was pretending this wasn't what it was. And the United States government, the National Institutes of Health, funded these studies for that 15-year period. So here's what Kaplan said. Kaplan said the only thing that he could think of was that it was possible that after the horrors of the Holocaust, after the horrific testing that took place in the camps, somehow these Jewish physicians had convinced themselves somehow that because they were conducting these studies in hospitals, because they were funded by the United States government, as I said, that was justifiable. We don't know. The documentation surrounding the grant proposals, I spent probably 4 or 5 months desperately trying to search for more data behind the aims of the studies, but they have all been, not surprisingly, destroyed.
And you do bring up a good point in the book that it's important to try not to fall into presentism, which, judging past actions by sort of the mores of today. But given their background and their history, it's kind of hard to swallow or to understand. I agree.
It's shocking. And it's also important to note that the United States had signed the Nuremberg Codes, which called for informed consent. So it's really hard to understand how they could have swallowed that.
Well, on the same topic, let's talk a little bit about the twin studies, because I think a lot of people may have seen the documentary film, I think it was Three Identical Strangers, based on the twin studies that were carried out by these same scientists at Louise Wise. So can you give us a little overview of that?
Yes, there was a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, who was named Viola Bernard, a German Jew. She'd been born in the United States. She was her father was a tobacco magnate, and she'd grown up with great privilege and was a very, very smart woman, obviously for her time, to have gone not only to university, but also to have become a doctor. She too was on the board of Louise Wise and was absolutely obsessed with not only the proper matching techniques, and she was very much behind the testing and the skin prognostications from Shapiro. She also was the mastermind behind the study that separated identical twins and triplets, placed them in homes of different socioeconomic backgrounds to try to answer once and for all what mattered more, nature or nurture. And if you have seen the film, you don't see mention of her name, which is peculiar, but I know in documentary film, you need to be able to have the voice. You need to be able to present information in a narrative way. And they relied on the voice that was on tape of Peter Neubauer, who was a refugee, German Jewish refugee. Actually, no, I think he was. Anyway, he was a Yekka, and he was at NYU, and the two of them conducted this study for decades.
Yeah, and I think some of his papers are actually at the Leo Baeck Institute, Peter Neubauer.
And they too justified their aims by thinking, we don't know for sure, and we'll get to that in a minute, but they believed that by separating these babies who shared every single gene, that they would be able to really establish the supremacy of either nature or nurture. But we don't know what the aims of the study are, because I'm sure, as many people know, as you and I have discussed, all of the documentation behind that so-called research is sealed at Yale University until 2065.
And what is the justification for that date?
Well, again, we don't know, because all of the data are secret. But the theory is that the youngest set of twins who were separated, and there were at least 11 sets of twins, and of course, most infamously, one set of identical triplets, that the youngest of those cohorts will be about 98 years old. And maybe they just thought, okay, well, once it became clear that the study had taken place and some of these twins and triplets had miraculously discovered one another, the attention was turned toward Louise Wise. It didn't look good. The optics were bad, and they shuttled all of the the data behind the study off to Yale. And there have been lawsuits after lawsuit after lawsuit to try to gain access to that material, but it hasn't been forthcoming.
And I know clearly a lot has changed since that time. So how do you both feel about how adoption foster care is currently handled, and of course how DNA has changed everything?
Margaret, I'll jump in. One thing that we need to just sort of establish is that adoption has shifted quite a bit from the period after the war, in which adoptions were secret and birth records for any surrendered child in 48 states were sealed, and that left the adoptee's original identity a complete state secret, except to bureaucrats who had access to the vital statistics records. In the stead of, once an adoption was finalized, an amended birth certificate was issued listing the child's adoptive name and his adoptive parents as his or her original mother and father. That created a very thick line separating birth families from adoptive families for decades, and DNA shifted that immensely. Obviously, anybody who has $99 and can send their saliva off to a big tech company is very likely to be able to reunite or find relatives he or she didn't know about. So that has shifted the landscape immensely. And adoptions today, for the most part, are open, which means, at least domestic adoptions, which means that the birth parents typically are able to choose the parents with whom they want to place their son or daughter. And the relationship is theoretically open, and their identities are not a secret, but those are very, very difficult to enforce. They don't always work out. There's a lot of fraud and corruption, far more than I ever imagined until I started investigating that. But that's how, yes, it's different, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
Margaret, do you want to talk about the work that you've done with trying to help families today?
Well, basically, I had almost no idea that all this was going on until Gabrielle, did her research and shared it with me. And my feeling on adoption has always been, it's a wonderful thing, but there's going to be good ones and bad ones. And when I found out all the lies from the agency and even the write-up that David was given, which was complete lies, I said, this can't happen to other people. If my son had known medically what was going on, he became very close to my youngest daughter. They realized they were both musicians and singers. It's not fair. And also, I've been, contacted and spoken to so many, and Gabrielle has even more than I have heard from, people who were either adoptees, adopted children, or were birth parents. And there's some women like in their 90s or 95 even, who don't know what happened to their child. And I mean, it's a horrible thing. I really thought I'd go to my death not knowing. Mm-hmm. So what I'm hoping to do, as people want to know the truth, whatever way I can, I want to give them hope. Mm-hmm. With David and me, thank God, I got to see him before he passed. He knew how much he was loved. We saw how much he loved us and how happy he was. I was so grateful that he had wonderful adoptive parents. So I don't want other birth parents, adoptees, or adoptive parents to have to not know who they are. Every person should know who they are. And also, the medical and everything. I mean, it's again, nature versus nurture, and you're a whole person. You're a human being. Nobody has a right to keep that from you.
Let's go back a little bit to David's story, because as you said, he had a good adoptive family, and he was raised by an infertile couple who were Holocaust survivors, and had a nice life with them, as far as we know. And interestingly, his adoptive father was a famous cantor, and he became a cantor. So can you talk a little bit about his life?
Okay.
Margaret?
I don't know, go first then.
No, go ahead, Margaret. Go ahead.
Okay. I was like, shocked when I spoke to him. And we had like 7 months because he called me the 1st, I believe, of May, and he passed the 25th of December, I think it was. At that point, I was back in Germany. And just so much stuff, like the sports. He used to, his family, which, he was a cantor, wasn't that thrilled that he was that into sports. David loves sports. My husband, my son, loves sports. My father-in-law and my father, and then also the singing. And to me, he had never said anything bad to me about his parents. He sent me home with tons of pictures, and I just felt so blessed that he was so loved and cherished by them. So, from that standpoint, and I was able to catch up with the pictures from his bar mitzvah. He spent a lot of time in Israel. I spoke to a lot of his friends that I got to meet through him, and then also through Gabrielle from, basically all over the world. And I mean, it was just, from all standpoints, it's again, the whole family. It's different families, but you're connected. It's the
Gabrielle, did you want to add something?
Yes, it's just just an aside about speaking of the lies, just to draw that out a little bit. Margaret was told when she was threatened to the social worker told her that if she didn't sign the paper, she would send her to reformatory school or to juvie, as Margaret was saying. Before that threat, she said, a diplomat is going to adopt your son this week. If you don't sign these papers, you don't have anything to offer your son. We've got a diplomat ready to go who's going to, and Margaret was led to believe that this, her son was going to be raised in splendid embassies across the globe. And that didn't happen. David was in foster care for another many months and ultimately adopted by a loving, cerebral, beautiful couple who were Romanian Holocaust survivors, but they were no diplomats. And they lived, Margaret earlier alluded to a time at the park, they lived 10 blocks from each other in the Bronx. Is that right, Margaret?
I think so.
Yeah, 10 blocks from each other. So Margaret was envisioning this fabulous lifestyle of her baby in Spain or Israel as a baby pioneer, fill in the blank. And he was in a walk-up 10 blocks away with his very nice parents.
And it is lovely that he was raised in such a musical family, and there's such musical talent in your family. And I know that was something that really drew your daughter to him as well, right?
And the great thing was they had no idea. Neither of them knew, they didn't have a connection. We have no idea. It was probably whoever it was connected to was killed in the Holocaust. But for the two of them to find each other was just beyond amazing. Sharing the love for music. And to me, him being adopted by a cantor and giving back to the world, I mean, he had to stop, I think, in 1990 something, because his voice just, wasn't there anymore. And then he worked as a businessman. But I mean, when you see him sing, when you hear him, you just feel this love. And everybody I spoke to just absolutely adored him. He was a wonderful, wonderful person, the same way my husband was. So it's, even though they both died too young, 56 and 52, they left something of themselves in this world. And, that's what you leave behind you is what life is all about.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to learn about all these people and the stories and the larger history in the book. So I think we should put a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in purchasing the book, which I highly recommend. Let's go take some audience questions, and we may have time for a few more. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. The first question is for you, Margaret. Where did you and George attend high school? And did you attend college being newly married and pregnant with Lisa?
we both went to George Washington High School in Washington Heights. And then I also went to night school at Roosevelt High School in the Bronx, so I could combine my credits so I could graduate with an academic diploma. And George, he was supposed to go to play baseball to Ohio State. He didn't. He ended up going to the community college. Well, at least it was growing up in the Bronx Community College. I never got to go back to college, but I took lots of extended education credits. I was on the school board, the shul board, and I worked with Open Classroom for children. So I took whatever courses I could when I could, but I was never able to go back because we became a big family. Also took care of my parents and my in-laws, and life took over.
And your husband didn't take that sports scholarship because you two got married.
He coached sports. Coached all the time.
The next question is for Gabrielle. Did you speak with Linda Gordon about the eugenics movement and its relationship to the decisions to measure intelligence, et cetera?
I did not, but Harry Shapiro, the forensic anthropologist, was president of the American Eugenics Society during the time he was making these racial declarations. So I didn't speak with Linda Gordon, but I did immerse myself in a great deal of the eugenics literature that was very popular at the time. In fact, just as an aside, Rabbi Wise, who was the rabbi of the Free Synagogue on the Upper West Side, was also quite interested in eugenics and would allow prominent eugenicists to come preach, not on Shabbat, of course, but they would come and deliver eugenics lectures at the synagogue, which was also surprising to me, but it happened.
There's a question, Gabrielle, do you know how many babies were placed with Holocaust survivors? And then sharing a personal story about a cousin whose baby was placed with Holocaust survivors by Louise Wise.
I don't think that Louise Wise even gathered statistics on that, but I do know that I don't want to say that they were given preferential treatment, but I do believe that especially with the Jewish Agency, there was an urgency to place children with people who had lost so much, to give them hope in the new world about creating a family. Again, I didn't see any statistics on this, but it did seem to me, and especially just as an aside, the Rosenbergs, Ephraim and Esther, who adopted David, were well beyond the age limit that Louise Wise had set. I believe the age limit was, I don't remember it, but it was mid 30s for women and maybe late 30s, as much as 40 for men. That cutoff was quite strict, but for the Rosenbergs, at least it had been relaxed because they were quite a bit older than that. So I wondered, it's a great question, and I did wonder, did they get leniency from the board, from social workers, because of what they had survived?
A question for Margaret, if you're comfortable talking about this. You mentioned the connection of your youngest daughter with your son. Did your other children also form a connection with him?
Well, my other children, because of their families and work, were not able to go to Portland, but they spoke with him. They did, I guess, Skype, FaceTime, and on the phone, and text back and forth. So all my children, got to speak with David, correspond with him and his children. It was wonderful.
Here's a question for you, Margaret. Having met your son, have your views on the effects of parenting or genetics on children's development changed at all?
I think it's a combination. I think, you're born with your genetics, and what you become, part of that, is in you, but also it's who you're with. and what you see and how you grow up and how you're treated. Love does wonders. And, I think the fact that he was in a loving family and was so cherished gave me comfort. I know it's not always like that, but I think it's a combination of both.
Here's another question for you, Margaret. What was your relationship with your parents like after you and George officially married?
After we were married, both families shared holidays. Everybody was happy because I was married. It was kosher. We got married in George's shul in Washington Heights, of Sholem, and I guess with them, nobody ever talked about it, but they when Lisa was born, they showed her off, and then with Mark, he had a huge bris, so it was just like it was great, but like I said, nobody ever spoke about it. George and I spoke about it to each other, and that was it.
And a question, how did you break the news about the other child to your 3 children?
I think the words I used were, everybody has a skeleton in their closet. And first I called Sherry. She was I think on Skype, or I don't remember how I called her. She was in Berlin.
But it wasn't until David had reached out to you.
Yes.
They spent got into adulthood without knowing about him, correct?
Yes, which, and I had thought about doing that when George died in 2000, and I was having a hard time, grieving with his death. And my neighbor sent me to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and that was the first time I brought it up. I said to him, I don't know if I should go to my death. They have a brother out there. He's probably in Europe or somewhere, or in Israel. I have no way of finding him. There was no DNA or anything at that point. And I had searched and searched, and I could not find. I have his new birth certificate, the amended one. I still, and he passed years ago, I still cannot get the original birth certificate. It's like Stephen Mark Earle never existed. So, and then I spoke to my other 2 kids. And I think the main thing is they were beyond shocked. Mm-hmm. They could not believe that George and I, kept this quiet all our life. But George kept saying, what are we telling them? It's just going to hurt them because there's nothing we can do.
And even in 2000, you mentioned to me the other day that the psychologist you spoke to said to keep it a secret, even in 2000.
Yes, it was the same words. You just have to, this never happened. Pretend it never happened. I walked out of there and I never went back. I could not believe that I was hearing the same thing.
Here's a question, maybe you can take this one, Gabrielle. Is the Louise Wise Agency still in business? If not, when did it close and why?
It shuttered finally in 2004, and it had been sued a number of times. It ultimately did declare bankruptcy and closed up. But one of the reasons why was because, in general, it wasn't because of the weight of the lawsuits, which I was certain that had to be it. But in fact, the landscape of adoption had shifted so much, and Louise Wise's business model was really dedicated to the closed adoption system, did not want to get involved with the open adoption arrangements, none of that. So ultimately, they just didn't keep in step with the times and they closed.
Here's a question. Was David an only child?
Yes. With the Rosenbergs, yes. Yeah.
And it was later in life for them. They were an older couple who had been unable to have children. So yes, right. He was an only child. And the question, did David have children?
3.
Yeah.
2 sons and a daughter.
And you're in touch with them, Margaret?
Yes, my grandsons and my daughter-in-law have been to my house. Now we're not that much in touch because they're on the other side of the country and because of COVID. My granddaughter's here, she's 4.5. She's not vaccinated, and Sherry was extremely, didn't want me exposed to anything. She was terrified that I would get sick. But my grandson, Noah, he came and he stayed here overnight, and he came to see us. And they're young adults. All, my other 5 grandchildren are all young adults, and I'm very blessed to have all of them.
A question to both of you. Louise Wise Agency was a respected social work agency at that time. What is your feeling now about how the social work profession legitimized the process of predatory accepting babies and placing them without the birth mother's permission?
I believe that they, much like the physicians on the board, who, and we discussed this earlier, I believe that they justified this. The whole closed adoption system was really promoted, the narrative of it was promoted as a win-win for everybody involved. The birth mother didn't have to deal with the shame of having a child out of wedlock. The child who was adopted didn't have to live with the stigma of having been quote unquote illegitimate, and adopted parents had the chance to create a new family after years of infertility. This is what they told themselves. Even they didn't believe it. For my research in the book, I did meet several retired social workers who I think feel incredible remorse at this point in their lives. One woman said, we were in love with our power. We believed we had a God complex. We were young women. We weren't doctors. Doctors really had, they were at the top of the social pyramid in those years. But these young women, as one woman put it, she said, we felt like we were on the admissions team at Harvard. We got to choose which baby went to which couple, and it was exciting. And I was shocked by that level of candor. I appreciated it, and I think it's very important, but I think looking back now, I'm certain looking back now that many of these women feel immense remorse. Another woman told me she'd grown up in an Orthodox home, and she specifically, you either dealt with prospective adoptive families or birth mothers. And the person who said that she felt like she was on the admissions team, she dealt with adoptive parents. And another woman who, as I said, grown up in an Orthodox home, said her job was to deal with birth mothers. And she said, I knew every single time I told them, don't worry, honey, you're going to go on with your life. You're going to have children of your own, as if this one wasn't, but children of your own. You'll go on, make like this never happened. She said, every time that came out of my mouth, I knew I was lying.
And there's a question, were other adoption agencies enacting similar policies at that time?
I think nationwide, this was pretty standard. Louise Wise was, I would say it was unfortunately among the most egregious because of the experimentation that they did on babies who certainly did not have informed consent. Louise Wise was acting as the agent for informed consent. I expected to hear about other similarly terrible practices elsewhere. That has not come to the fore, at least yet. So, but this was pretty standard nationwide. The women were treated like indentured servants in their maternity homes. I didn't hear of great experiences from women around the country or about adoption agencies around the country. No.
All right, well, we're coming up on 5 o'clock. We're going to put a link in the chat to a very quick survey, which helps us plan future programs, if you don't mind clicking into that. Again, I highly recommend the book. The link to that is in the chat as well. And I'd like to thank Margaret and Gabrielle for spending this time with us and having this conversation. It was really interesting, and I do appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.